Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I see that we still have people joining, so I'll give everyone a minute to get signed on while I make just some initial announcements. So my name is Nicole, and I'm with the San Diego Law Library, and I have here with me today our speaker, Kimberly Sims, who will
Hello.
be discussing cannabis law, legislative updates, challenges, and federal outlook. I just have a couple of housekeeping things to do before we get started. First of all, you should have already received the handout for today's webinar. If you have not received the handout, please email refdesk@sdlawlibrary.org. Again, it's refdesk, refdesk at sdlawlibrary.org, and we'll resend that handout. If you need our email, you can always go to San Diego Law Library's website, and our email will be on there. Next, for those of you who are here for CLE credit, this class is for 1 hour of general participatory MCLE credit, and we'll be issuing a participatory MCLE credit for those of you who are verified to have attended today. So please be looking out for that in your email later this afternoon, and remember to check your spam and junk mailboxes. Also, if you're attending today's session via audio and dialed in using a phone number, please send us an email with your name, your phone number, and your bar number in order to receive an MCLE certificate. Again, you only need to do this if you're using your phone number, not the email that you use to sign in. So only if you're dialing in. This is also an interactive presentation, so you'll have the opportunity to submit questions during the presentation to our speaker, but we do ask that you use the Q&A function for that. Under the Q&A function, you'll be able to ask the question with your name or anonymously. It's up to you, and we'll try to get through as many as we can today. And then lastly, you'll also receive a link to a survey at the end of this presentation. We do appreciate any of you who would take the time to answer that survey. And with that, I will turn things over to our speaker, Kimberly Sims.
Great. Thank you so much. And as always, thank you for having me. I think this is the fourth or maybe fifth year that I've had the pleasure of being invited to the law library to do an MCLE. Um, you know, there's so much that's happening every day that even as recently as last night, I was clicking through, and this morning clicking through all my my news and my cannabis happenings, and well aware that something that I wrote a day or two ago might actually be different today. So what you're going to get is, a snapshot of where we are in the cannabis industry federally, and then I'm going to try and bring it down to talk a little bit about California specifically. But it's a wild time to be alive in the cannabis industry. And I look forward to sharing with you some of my knowledge and some interesting facts. Next slide, please. So I think just my contact info, nothing super crazy, but I have been practicing in this space for, I believe it'll be 16 years this summer, which is, again, it's a long time to be part of an industry that's rapidly evolving and changing. Those of us who have been in the industry for a long time, or even a short time, often joke that 1 year in cannabis is like a dog year. So we all feel like we've been doing this for a really, really, really long time. And there's really never a dull moment or a day without some sort of challenge that we're facing. My focus in my practice specifically is corporate and transactional and regulatory compliance. So if you've ever been to a dispensary in Southern California, I may be their general counsel. Or if you've ever had the pleasure of touring a farm up in Northern California, as pictured here, on the screen, I may have done some work with them as well. So I work with all license types, all up and down the supply chain, all throughout the state of California. And it's just, again, it's a wild time to be alive in the cannabis industry. It's changing super rapidly. And I'm excited to share some of my industry insights with you. I think what you'll see, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. What we'll see here throughout this next hour or so are a few themes that you'll hear me mention time and time again. One is going to be, where are we going federally? I think that's the thing that most people are in this moment interested in, and that's where there's the most movement and activity. You'll hear me talk a lot about the challenges that our industry is facing in terms of market consolidation and the strain that is put upon us through taxes and the heavy regulation. And so I think, reform, market consolidation, and the heavy burden of taxes again, there'll be themes that you're going to see throughout. So if we're looking just again, if a quick little snapshot of where we are as of November this year, you can see that almost every state has some sort of marijuana program, whether it be adult use, medical, or even just a CBD low THC. Some states started that way. Like Florida is a really great example where they started with a CBD low THC program. They moved to medical. And then this year, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. This year, I think Florida is just a super interesting case study. For those of you who don't know, it was the most talked about state, the one that we all had our eyes on, wherein we believed that we would see adult use pass. So that was Florida Amendment 3. Florida is a state where you need 60% to pass for a constitutional amendment. And unfortunately, the vote failed by only getting 55.9%. However, what it does show is the will of the voters to have adult use cannabis accessible in the state of Florida. So, it'll be interesting to see. That's one to continue to watch, to see if the legislature will make moves to excuse me, make moves to enact the will of the voters. Florida, I think, is also a super interesting case study because typically in the past we have seen large lobbying organizations foot the bill for these ballot initiatives. National Organization for Reform of Marijuana Law, Marijuana Policy Project, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, but this time. Trulieve, which is an operator, multi-state operator with a heavy presence in Florida, actually more or less footed the bill for the entire campaign to the tune of over $140 million. So that likely hurt their bottom line. And I think what we're seeing there then is ultimately a shift to where the industry is going to start funding its own initiatives as opposed to some of these groups that have traditionally taken that on more. So again, I think Florida is just a super interesting one to talk about because it was the most anticipated in November, and certainly the one that I watched and was fairly surprised to see didn't pass, especially given all of the resources that were put into it. So again, when we look at the active licenses in general, what we're seeing is a decline. We had our peak in 2022. And again, I'm not speaking about California, I'm speaking about nationally. So in late 2022, there were approximately 44,300 active licenses. And that has been a steady decline ever since. And then you can even look here on the slide, some more up-to-date data. So in comparison to the first 3 quarters of 2023, there was a drop of nearly 11% of licenses in 2024. So again, it's interesting because you have a lot of states that are coming online. For example, Ohio rolled out their adult use, and New York City finally picked up the pace on issuing and approving their licenses. So those weren't necessarily new markets that were added. Well, Ohio was, but those additions ultimately offset the overall decline. And again, what we're seeing here is extremely arduous regulations. Even to get a license is so expensive, so process intensive. Oftentimes in California, for example, you need to have your local approval first, and local approval is largely based upon zoning. So oftentimes people are holding on to real estate for 9, 10, 11, 12 months before they're even approved. And with everything that has happened in the economy over the past few years, that's just not something that can really be done. Again, you have, and so what also impacts that are the delays in licensing. And then, in particular, we are starting to see some very large exits from our more seasoned states, Colorado and California. And we'll get into California with some more specificity. But again, we are seeing a lot of market consolidation. We are seeing multi-state operators who are coming in and picking up some of the distressed assets, but again, then they're consolidating their licenses and holdings. So it still, I think, has this reputation of being like a flashy, glamorous industry where there's, so much money to be made. And what I will say is there is some money to be made, but it is not at any, in any way, shape, or form what I thought or what people thought when we, look back to 2020, 2021, and 2022, when we were seeing so much activity, so many entry points. It's really changed quite a bit. And, I think my opinion is that that's a trend that we're going to continue to see. Next slide. And so here again, these are some visuals to back up what I'm saying, where you can see the impact of the losses of licensure. I think in particular, the map is really interesting. This is from MJ Biz Daily, and it's actually interactive. So you can click on it and then get more information. But again, it does show the change in the number of active licenses and what things, what we're looking at. So again, that's just a visual, I thought a very good visual representation of some of the things I just mentioned. Next slide. Okay, so the elephant in the room, the thing that everybody wants to talk about, the thing that I would say I'm probably most interested in when I'm looking at the year ahead is federal rescheduling. Will it happen? Won't it happen? Is there a glimmer of hope? Where are we in this process? And I intend to spend the next I don't know, 20 to 30 minutes really diving into that and trying to give you guys some good data, some fun quotes as to what's been happening. But it is an ever moving process, and it's been a long time coming, and I'm excited to delve into it. So next slide, please. Before we really dive into rescheduling and what's going on there, it's important to understand what the current status of marijuana is. So I think most people, by and large, know that it is governed by the Controlled Substance Act. It is considered a Schedule I drug, and it's important also to note that what I'm talking about here today mostly is marijuana. It's not hemp related, and hemp is cannabis with less than 0.3% THC. I will touch upon the Farm Bill ever so lightly, but that is a whole other ball of wax, a whole other seminar topic. But if there are people listening in today that have a larger interest in hemp and what's going on in California, as well as with the Farm Bill, I'm happy to chat another time about that. And again, I'll touch on it briefly, but it's important to understand that what we're talking about here is anything with more than 0.3% THC. And it's interesting because really, cannabis is like it's a botanical term or a term of art. There's not really, it's the same plant that we're talking about here, but they're treated very, very differently. Next slide, please. And under the Controlled Substance Act, Schedule I, it classifies, marijuana as a high potential for abuse, no currently accepted medical use and treatment, and a total lack of accepted safety. So that's where we are right now in terms of what the law says. And there has long been a debate over whether we should be rescheduling, moving it to Schedule 2 or 3, or descheduling and removing it from the schedule altogether and regulating it much like we do alcohol and tobacco. Personally, I am a proponent of descheduling, but I am also a person that understands incremental change is often how, you get to the finish line. And so while a rescheduling, it's not my favorite thing in the world, I think it's it's the direction that things need to take. But there's even there's a large split in the industry as a whole as to whether rescheduling or descheduling would be more effective. Or even, I guess effective isn't really the best word. The preference, because each presents different things. So understanding that that's where we are at the moment, let's talk about what's going on with rescheduling, because it's been, it's basically been like two, plus years in the making. And so next slide, please. So we'll kind of go through the timeline of rescheduling in a few minutes, actually. But first, I want to talk a little bit about so the current status that we're is that we are looking at a proposal to remove marijuana from Schedule 1 and move it to Schedule 3. And so again, by way of background, I want to make sure that everyone understands what that will do and what it won't do. So again, listen, it is a huge step forward, and I think the the medical impact is huge because it will finally show that the government recognizes that there are accepted medical uses and that the potential for addiction is not that of cocaine and some of the other drugs that it's currently listed on Schedule 1 with. And so that will obviously provide more legitimacy to the industry. Hopefully, it will inspire greater congressional support. But the most important thing that Schedule 3 would do would be to eliminate 280E. And what IRS Code 280E basically says is that if you're in the business of trafficking a controlled substance, Schedule 1 or 2, then you are not entitled to any standard or ordinary business deductions. Now, you think of this in the context of like dealing cocaine. I don't know how many cocaine dealers are necessarily filing their taxes. They are supposed to be, but they're not. But what it's saying is, hey, you don't get to deduct your baggies and your cell phone and pager. I don't think people have pagers anymore, but that is problematic for the marijuana industry because they are already so heavily regulated and so heavily taxed at the local and the state level. Then to not be able to access standard and ordinary business deductions as any business would is truly crippling. And so again, well, Schedule 3 doesn't ultimately legalize marijuana. It doesn't open the door for interstate commerce or resolve inconsistencies that are state to state or resolve access to banking. It is a huge step forward and it would provide a lot of financial relief to the industry. But that alone isn't enough because it doesn't open access to banking. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more as well. So again, Schedule 3 it's imperfect, but it is certainly a step in the right direction. Okay, next slide. So how did we even get here? In October of 2022, so now, 2+ years ago, President Biden called on the U.S. Attorney General and the Secretary of Department of Health and Human Services to begin the process of reviewing marijuana and its status under federal law. And this was a campaign promise. And it, again, was a pretty monumental moment policy-wise. But I think that it is important to note that from the beginning, doing things this way was, wrought with controversy, and we will get into some of that more. But a lot of people were not happy that this process was ultimately, kicked off by Biden, and then the Attorney General, Merrick Garland at the time, went forward and proposed a rule for rescheduling marijuana. But typically, it would be like the DEA administrator, Ann Milgram, who would do this. And so from the jump, the way that this process started has received, tremendous controversy. Next slide. Okay. So November, Department of Health and Human Services starts their review, and they dig in, lots of research, a lot of things that were happening, excuse me, behind the scenes to figure out how to assess marijuana and its efficacy and use in the medical setting. And in August of 2023, that's this memo that is here, Health and Human Services recommended moving cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, arguing that marijuana no longer meets the criteria for the most restrictive classification, citing potential medical uses and safety considerations. And then in August of, of 2024, I believe it was, or also 2023, yes, that we got a fuller formal memo from Health and Human Services that the DEA, a memo to the DEA, confirming its recommendation to reschedule. And this August 29th memo was a 252-page memo. And for quite some time, the industry was asking to see the whole memo. And it wasn't until January 12th of 2024 where that full memo was publicly released. Next slide, please. So then we get to April 30th of 2024, where the DEA actually makes their issue a formal proposal, to reclassify marijuana from Schedule 1 to 3, and again acknowledging that there are potential medical value to it, and then that decision is just it was such a huge historical policy shift because it came, 50 years after marijuana was first placed as a Schedule 1 drug. And it's a very public announcement of what we hope to be the end of the war on drugs, particularly with respect to marijuana. So this was a huge thing. The DEA perhaps wasn't very supportive necessarily, but in April of 2024, we see that shift. And so again, that was a pretty big deal. Next slide, please. So, all right, on May 16th of 2024, we finally have a formal process that is initiated, and the Justice Department announced that the Attorney General filed a notice with the Federal Register to begin the process of reclassifying marijuana. The AG determined there is no significant evidence suggesting marijuana does not require scheduling under the CSA. And the Department of Justice stated that Garland had initiated the formal rulemaking process. And this included a proposed rule, and that started a 60-day public comment period. And I think really interesting, we can go to the next slide, although I might be jumping ahead a little. So I'm going to talk a little bit more just about the analysis of the public comments. Perfect. So 40,000 plus comments from governors, members of Congress, medical professionals, advocacy groups on each side, attorneys, accountants, weighed in on this. And there were two separate analyses of these comments, and they indicated that the bulk of submissions were in support of reform. And then there's another company that's very well respected in our industry, data analytics, called Headset. And according to a report from Headset, approximately 35% of the comments submitted agreed with the Biden plan to reschedule, but 57% actually said, no, it should be descheduled. It should be removed from the schedule altogether. And I think a really fun fact is that Headset said, oh, that's a tongue twister. Headset said that turnout during the public comment period, which began in May, has shattered previous DEA records, surpassing even the highly contentious 2020 telemedicine rules that garnered approximately 38,000 comments. So again, this is a topic where I think the American people have said time and time again, in poll after poll after poll, that it doesn't belong on Schedule 1 anymore. Next slide, please. So this is where we're going to spend um, a bulk of time now is talking about in these next two slides what happened basically this at the end of last year and the beginning of this year with rescheduling because excuse me, there was a ton of movement. So we had hearing or yes, we had hearings scheduled for December 2nd of 2024. And I admit, even I was like, I don't know if this is really going to happen. There's so much controversy here. Who knows if this will really move forward. It's tough to say. Um, Again, as I mentioned, it was sort of wrought with controversy from the beginning, and even prior to this 12-2 hearing, there has been controversy, and I want to explain some of what it is so that you can kind of again understand where we are. So prior even to these hearings on December 2nd, Judge Mulrooney, who's overseeing the proceedings, notified the DEA that it provided insufficient information about selected witnesses. And so that created some hubbub. And then the DEA is designated as a proponent of the proposed rule. But understandably, there's a lot of skepticism about where the agency's leadership actually stands on the issue and whether or not it's going to insert bias. Into this process. And then when you couple that with this break of precedent that I mentioned previously, where it's usually the DEA administrator that would sign a proposed rule, um, there that again, it's mired in controversy already, and we haven't really even started. Um, on November 18th, and this is important background as well, two organizations, Hemp for Victory and Village Farms International, filed a joint motion asking the judge to remove the DEA from the rescheduling based on its ex parte communication with anti-rescheduling parties regarding the merits of the proposed rule. And so the group that it in particular referencing is a group that has said for many years that no matter what happens, any progress with rescheduling will, be met with the full force of, of their dollars and their anti-legalization rhetoric. And that group is Smart Approaches to Marijuana. And interestingly enough, they've also been designated by the DEA as a participant in these hearings. So again, this is, again, we're wrought with issues from the jump, lack of trust for the DEA. And on November 27th, the motion was denied. And in that order, the judge stated that he actually lacked the authority to grant the removal that was sought. So all of this is happening before we even get to December 2nd. So we get to the December 2nd. It's live stream. You log on and watch, and it's the first public hearing on the rescheduling. And Judge Mulrooney said these hearings will serve as a procedural day to address legal and logistical issues and discuss the future dates for the evidentiary hearing on the merits. There will be no testimony, and the focus was ultimately to determine witness availability. And Judge Mulrooney eyed mid-January. So well, I guess we're at the end of January now. Although I think for many, it feels like it's January like 95th, but alas, it is January 29th. So they were eyeing mid-January for testimony to begin. So it's all well and fine. We're moving towards things. We're wrapping up the end of the year. We have this motion that was denied, and we're all ready for mid-January to come and these hearings to start and really, get into it here. And on January 6th, the Hemp for Victory and Village Farms International filed a motion for reconsideration and interlocutory appeal, asking for reconsideration of that November 26th order, which was denied their request to remove the DEA from the role of a proponent of the proposed rule. And then on January 13th, Judge Mulrooney denied the motion for reconsideration and said the movements did not sufficiently establish a clear error of law, newly discovered evidence, or a need to prevent manifest injustice. Importantly, the movements further requested, in the event their relief was again denied, that the ALJ allow them to appeal his decision to the DEA administrator. However, again, lots of moving pieces here. Judge Mulrooney did grant the movement's request for the interlocutory appeal, and he said, to the extent my analysis is found to be in error on review, I am willing to certify that the allowance of this interlocutory appeal could potentially avoid exponential delay, expense, or prejudice. And so at that time, the judge canceled the January 21st hearings that were supposed to be on the merit, and those proceedings are now stayed pending resolution of the appeal. And Judge Mulrooney further ordered both sides to provide him joint status updates on the appeal 90 days from the issuance of the order and every 90 days thereafter. And ultimately, punted all of this back to the DEA for further review and action. Next slide, please. So, okay, so great. So now we're basically again just in a holding pattern. And again, the reason for the pause is this, potential bias, this concern that the agency is stacking the process against the marijuana industry and true proponents for reform by stacking the witnesses. And again, Mulroney basically is like, you know what, DEA administrator, you guys were jonesing for this. It's on you, back in your court. So Milgram was set to assess the matter and determine whether to proceed or make adjustments to the rescheduling process altogether. And I do want to just I think there are a couple other interesting things that Judge Mulrooney said worth noting. And so I will read these quotes to you. And then I do want to share just a little bit of the, industry reaction because that was, it was interesting. It's always interesting to see when an organization is, desperately, or excuse me, a group is desperately trying to make progress, but then within there's, divisiveness even within the industry. So, the judge reprimanded the DEA for its unprecedented and astonishing defiance of an evidential directive. He also characterized the DEA's bad behavior as especially unusually bad, even among the numerous extraordinary and puzzling actions taken thus far by the government during the course of this proceeding. And then he further cited some allegations against the DEA. He said, which demonstrate a puzzling and grotesque lack of understanding and poor judgment for high-level officials at a major federal agency with a wealth of prior experiencing with the Administrative Procedure Act. So that's where we are. Basically, next slide, please, is that the judge, oh, I don't know why that image isn't showing up. It should be the letter that Judge Mulrooney sent to DEA administrator, basically saying, "It's on you now, girl. You're going to have to do some things here." So again, I think a lot of people in the cannabis industry, in particular the National Cannabis Industry Association, which is a leading federal lobbying organization that has put in, I can't even begin to imagine how much time, effort, and energy this organization has dedicated to help get the industry to this point. And their president said, his name is Aaron Smith, "We're incredibly disappointed in this development, and it's particularly troubling that the setback is a result of action by those purporting to represent the interests of the cannabis industry." And that sentiment honestly was felt and shared by a lot of people. They felt it was sort of like the cut up the nose to spite the face, like, hey, we're getting somewhere, just let it keep going, let the process be the process. And so again, there was a lot of discord within the industry itself about what happened and the way that some of the proponents handled the situation. But if I think about where I was, at each of these various, moments in time, these historic policy shifts. For me, I've always thought, hey, this is great. This is a good step forward, but we are so far away from seeing the fruits of the labor here. I remember I had clients, back in April calling me and saying, this is amazing. I'm hearing the IRS is going to retroactively apply 280E to all of our taxes. And I'm like, yeah, that's not going to happen. And I think a lot of businesses that are struggling are just kind of like hanging on for dear life to see if they can make it to this next point so they can, reap the benefits of tax reform and see how that shakes out and hopefully maybe get some access to banking. But because it's federally illegal, access to traditional banking is still very difficult. There are a lot more smaller banks and credit unions that will now bank cannabis, but it's challenging. There's a lot of administrative red tape. It can take weeks and weeks and weeks to get an account set up, and then the fees associated with those accounts are incredibly high. So it's just very, very challenging. So we will see what happens. I think we are still in for, a lot of two steps forward, two steps back with this, as we've already seen. But I will be keeping a close eye on it, just like everybody else will. So we'll have to see what happens. I think the next check-in or data point that we'll have will be in March, when I believe that first 90 days will be up, and we'll have to see where things are. Next slide, please. So, there's always a chance for congressional reform, and we have confirmation hearings happening literally this very moment that can ultimately, impact where things go in the Trump administration. I think it's fair to say that he's a wild card. His administration is a wild card. You never really know what you're going to do. Trump's historical stance on cannabis has shifted over the past several years. And so, I think there's a chance that we could see some administrative support. But again, I don't know. And he did in his first term appoint Jeff Sessions, who rescinded something called the Cole memo, which was basically a memo under the Obama administration that said the Department of Justice and the DEA should really take a hands-off approach to enforcement of the Controlled Substance Act in states that have, a clear and robust regulation and marijuana programs. And the rescission of that memo sparked, again, a lot of controversy, a lot of outrage. I remember that day as well, fielding calls from, very worried clients. Ultimately, it was a lot of blustering. It didn't really do much, but it still, again, it caused controversy, it caused headaches, it caused fear in an industry that's really fighting for recognition. But we do know that Trump is a big supporter of states' rights, and so um, it's possible that we could see sort of a continuation of what we're seeing now, where states just sort of one by one piecemeal together what they're going to do with marijuana and how they're going to treat it. But he also did support Florida's ballot measure, Amendment 3, even though it didn't pass. And so a lot of people are taking that as a sign that perhaps he's more supportive than he's publicly stated. But then we also have to look at who he's appointing. And I think with respect to marijuana, in general, I think a golden rule is when someone shows you who they are, believe them. But I think here we do have to look at who he's appointing. So I'm going to jump around a little bit. I don't have on here the appointment for DEA. So that's going to be Derek S. Maltz. So that was on January 20th, this year, obviously. Retired DEA agent Derek Maltz was appointed acting DEA administrator. And I now will share a few quotes from Mr. Maltz regarding marijuana. So He said, "It's sad to see the Department of Justice is interfering with the DEA's scientific review that's required during the marijuana rescheduling process." And in 2022, he wrote, "For all the irresponsible politicians trying to get votes by legalizing marijuana, maybe it's time to understand the negative impacts from smoking this crap." And he's also been quoted saying that he believes it's a gateway drug. AOC and Ilhan Omar, who was actually just appointed to serve as the co-chair of the Congressional Cannabis Caucus, had some fun retorts to to that. So Omar said, "What is he, 100 years old? All of a sudden, all of that has been debunked for a really long time, and I think it's such a boomer thing to say." I don't know how old that man actually is. She also said, "First of all, we're not advocating for legalization so that kids can use it." So I really don't know why he's talking about the kids. It's really helpful for a lot of people who are struggling with all types of things. And then AOC chimed in, "Does he have a medical degree?" He doesn't even have a medical degree. We can learn from states that have not criminalized marijuana, but have treated it as a substance, the same as alcohol and many other substances as well. And so what is the impact of rescheduling? We don't know. It could slow or reverse the progress, or it could keep going as is. Um, the pick for AG Pam Bondi. So she's also served as her background is that she was a prosecutor, and then she was the first female attorney general in Florida. She opposed a constitutional ballot amendment that aimed to more broadly legalize marijuana. She worked very, very hard to keep Florida's smokable flower ban in place, and frustratingly, um, although not surprising, at the confirmation hearing, she was asked 4 or 5 specific questions about marijuana reform and rescheduling and descheduling, and her answer each time was, "If confirmed, I will give the matter careful consideration after consulting with appropriate department officials." So, like, we don't really know what that means. And then, we have Senate Majority Leader John Thune, who is a longtime opponent of cannabis reform. And, his influence could certainly and likely will create further tension between the Department of Justice and Congress on this issue. And it just makes it harder to get more like incremental reform. And pardon me, a larger reform. But I do think there's a possibility that we might see smaller incremental changes. So again, like, I'm hoping that maybe we could just get something with relationship to banking passed. But again, with Republicans controlling all 3 branches, it's it's hard to say. And as I often, have to even remind myself, but many in the industry, is that, like, this is the most important issue to us because it impacts our livelihood. But when you look at all the different things that are happening, and, every day is a new news cycle, it's hard to imagine that this is going to be a top priority. And I can understand that. So it's important to keep that, in mind. Next slide, please. I'm going to spend a minute or two just talking about, what kind of congressional reform might we see. I think possibly, again, we might finally see some access to banking. Trump has voiced support for that. So SAFER is the Banking Act, Secure and Fair Enforcement Regulation. It's been introduced, it was originally introduced in 2019. I think it's been reintroduced like 7 or 8 times. But basically, long and the short of it is that it would allow banks to provide services to the cannabis industry in states where it's legal. And it would basically give them safe harbor protection. Whereas in the past, I think it was 2014, but the Department of Justice put out a memo that basically said, like, yeah, with FinCEN, yeah, banks can do business with marijuana businesses in the states where it's legal, and they're probably not implicit in money laundering. And the banking industry was like, yeah, we're going to need a little bit more than that. And what the banking industry has asked for repeatedly, year after year after year, is a act of Congress to authorize them to provide banking services to the industry. And so again, it's not just as simple as banking your money, your cash, or being able to, pay your bills more easily. Um, it's merchant services, it's loans, it's access to capital that any small business would have is not readily available. And so that makes it really, really tricky. So as of right now, it's pending on the Senate floor. The bill passed the state banking commerce in September of 2023, but then it's kind of just hanging out. So again, we'll have to see. And then there is States 2.0, which is kind of what it sounds like. It basically allows it allows for what's already been going on at state level is states, make your own rules with respect to marijuana, but it does go a little bit further because it would allow for interstate commerce. And a lot of people believe, myself included, that that's part of what California needs to save itself is to be able to lawfully transport its flower. There's a huge oversupply of marijuana flower in the state, um, across state lines without that being a federal crime. And it would allow access to banking and financial services, and it would amend 280E, but it's not legalization, right? It's not what we're hoping for. Um, but again, incremental, I think is better than nothing, and that, access to banking and that relief under 280E, I cannot stress enough how desperately the industry needs those lifelines. Next slide, please. Okay, so that is my federal overview. I'm going to take one quick beat and look at these questions here. Okay, so one of these questions I will answer at the end, and that is about cannabis cafes. THC is the compounds that is the psychoactive compound in marijuana. So there are so many different cannabinoids, but THC is the one that we know, or most people know, and that's what's ultimately going to give you that high euphoric feeling. Whereas CBD and some of the other cannabinoids don't have that same effect. So,
And
go
then
ahead.
I don't want to interrupt, but we did have one participant say that they were unable to see the slides. I did have my coworker log on and they were able to see the slides, and I was able to confirm, Kimberly, you're able to see the slides. That's how we've been.
Yeah, I can
Yeah.
see them.
So as long as no one else, we've only had one complaint about not being able to, but if you aren't able to see the slides, please let us know in the Q&A. But I believe it is working. I just wanted to make that announcement.
Cool, thank you. And then, excuse me, I do see that question about cannabis cafes, and I'm happy to, it's a little slightly off topic, but I'm super excited to talk about it, and I do address it towards the end. So I'll just keep powering through. So what is going on in California? Guys, it's not great. It's not great. Next slide, please. So just super, super quick for background, the Medical and Adult Use of Cannabis Regulation and Safety Act, which is codified in the Business and Professions Code, is where we find all of our fun rules and regulations with respect to marijuana. There's also a wonderful website, the Department of Cannabis Control. It's really interactive. I think it's very I want to say consumer friendly. But I don't mean consumption of marijuana. I mean anyone who's interested in what's going on. And I'm happy to point certain resources out to people. So again, you should all have my email. If you're looking for something on the website, you can't find it, shoot me an email. I'm happy to help you. Next slide. But it is the Department of Cannabis Control that regulates our industry and at the state level. And we regulate cultivators, manufacturers, distributors, retailers, testing labs, and events. And each license requires its own, each license type requires local approval and then state approval. So again, a lot of what's going on is very, very dependent on local municipal law and where we can and cannot operate. So First things first is always get your local license. You'll look at your municipal code and see what your city or county allows for. And then once that's obtained, then you can go ahead and move forward with the state license process. Next slide, please. So here you can, again, you can see that we still have the majority of California that prohibits cannabis business types. And I think it's important to note that when we're looking at this 46% that do allow, and that's more like I did this, I used similar data from the Department of Cannabis Control's website in like April of last year. And these numbers shifted plus or minus 2 on each of this 46, 54, and 57. So, for the last 6 or 7 months, it's mostly stayed the same in terms of movement for cities and counties. But this is even including, for example, like a city like Irvine that allows for 2 testing labs. So yeah, I mean, that's wonderful. But when you're talking about, who allows what, you're also talking about cities that have caps on licensure. It's not like a free for all. So it's still really tricky to find a spot. And next slide, please. I do think, again, it's important to understand what's happening in California as a whole. So we are down. We had, as of the beginning of January, California had 8,559 active licenses. And that's down from 9,334 in April of last year. And we have seen about a 12.5% drop in cultivation licenses in particular. So, the trend here is an ongoing decline in the number of active licenses. And I think that that's an accurate reflection of the various struggles that the industry is facing. Next slide, which I think is just a quick licensing snapshot. So this is a really cool tool, I think, on the Department of Cannabis Control's website, where you can see how many licenses, and then you can even further analyze by way of license type. But again, right now we have an active 8,559. I would venture to say that if I were to check again in 6 months, or when I check again in 6 months, we will see a continue decline. Next slide, please. So listen, like, this is my opinion of what, problems plague the industry, and they are plentiful and bountiful. There's really not enough time for me to really dive into each one of these at the level which I would like to. But I will tell you that the tax strain on this industry is untenable. And you have, I've already mentioned 280E, which is, the really impacts the ability to deduct standard and ordinary business expenses. But we also have, on marijuana, we have local tax, then state sales tax, and then an excise tax. And there's a new tax law, AB 195, wherein there used to be a weight-based cultivation tax as well, and the cultivators had to pay, and the industry lobbied really, 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 really hard to get rid of that. It was strangling the industry. However, the trade-off for that was that California is raising the cannabis excise tax to as high as 19% to compensate for that loss of weight-based cultivation. And so there is a new industry group that's coming together to try and prevent that. There's also a lawsuit that was filed by Catalyst, which is a retailer that has about 26-ish locations, that is also challenging the CDTF's ability to collect sales tax on cannabis accessories. So, the example, and again, I could talk about this for hours. It's really interesting, but the example would be like if you have a vaping device and the oil that's in it. And the pen itself cost $40, but the amount of oil is like $5. And so that's a difference of paying $6 in excise taxes on the whole purchase versus paying 75 cents in excise tax on just the oil. And again, I could go into this, in great detail. But again, it's just another example of a tax grab. And this issue of incredibly strangling taxes, it trickles down to the consumer, which then bolsters the illicit market. So these are very much hand in hand, the tax issues and the preference to go to the illicit market. They play into each other. And we also have, as part of this tax conversation, approximately 15% of cannabis licenses are in default of their tax obligations as of January of 2024. And the state law mandates a penalty of 50% of the unpaid amount on top of the 10%, like the general 10% penalty, and an interest on those unpaid amounts. So, and the CDTFA has started revoking seller's permits of retailers in particular that are not paying their excise tax. And if you don't have a seller's permit, you lose your state license and you lose your local license. So again, it's a mess, and that's another reason you're starting to see some of that market consolidation is people just cannot afford to keep afloat. And the industry is facing exceptional challenges with securing traditional financing. So a lot of folks have to rely on debt financing. And it's reported that there's like at the end of 2026, some like $4 billion in delinquent payments and past due invoices that are coming due. And so again, all of these things give rise to a thriving illicit market. And when legal dispensaries have too high of prices, you have an oversupply, which I'll talk about in a minute, of flower, then you're ultimately going and a government that's not, I mean, try as they may, they're not equipped to enforce all of the illicit operators. I read that last year's total was approximately $191 million worth of cannabis that was illegal cannabis that was eradicated across 13 counties. Side note, guys, there are actually 58 counties in California. So you can again see like it's just you have a thriving illicit market due to the incredible challenges, debts, banking, taxes, incredible regulatory burdens that are ultimately leading, causing all of these problems. We also have, we have too many cultivation licenses. So the market's oversupplied, and that's leading to price compression. And the beginning of, I believe it was 2023, the state of California there was a cap on cultivation size, and they lifted that cap. So it used to be you couldn't cultivate more than 1 acre, and that cap was lifted. So now you have all these, legacy growers that have been growing and growing for years on their farms with these small farms, and ultimately they can't compete with something that has many millions of square footage like in Santa Barbara and Salinas County. So it's edging out these smaller growers, and that is problematic. Many people, this is their life, their life work. And then because of that, you're seeing price drop. So in 2018, when licensing first came on board, you were seeing like $1,500 to $2,000 a pound. Present day would be more like $400 to $600 a pound. So that's a huge, huge fall. And then, again, I said we could talk about hemp for hours and hours here, but there is also a divide in the marijuana industry as how we should regulate hemp. There is no doubt that hemp needs to be regulated and that there are dangerous products out there that aren't being tested and that don't contain what they say they contain, that are far too accessible to people, children involved, included. And I think that is highly problematic. But instead of regulating this in an efficient way, and maybe even trying to find some parity between how marijuana is regulated and hemp are regulated, given that they are indeed the same plant. What ultimately happened in September of last year was a ban on intoxicating hemp products, and it perhaps they were emergency regulations that are currently in place, prohibit hemp-derived THC and products with any detectable THC, including Delta 8, which is a synthetically derived cannabinoid that can actually get you very high. But it age gates it at 21, which I don't ultimately think is a huge problem. But what it does is it goes too far, right? It bans a lot of non-intoxicating hemp products, and it doesn't actually address the legitimate regulatory concerns that are shared by good actors. So there is a way to regulate this without destroying the entire hemp industry. We can create regulations around testing and advertising and age, but ultimately, an outright ban, which is a trend a lot of states are going in, is challenging. The 2018 Farm Bill, which does have some THC loopholes, has been extended, and there are currently then two bills, one Republican version and one Democratic version, that are being proposed. The Republican version proposes a ban on hemp-derived THC outright, whereas the Democratic version redefines THC limits as 0.3 of total THC. So again, you have THC and then THCA. There's a lot of different fun sciencey stuff to it, but there is even opposition about total weighting it based on total THC. So again, there are so many different things that plague us. It's difficult to transfer a license depending on what jurisdiction you're in, and their rules. So again, it's very local specific. And again, incredibly, high regulatory costs for compliance and things of that nature. Next slide. And I know we're just at 1 o'clock, so if you have to hop off, no big deal. I think I only have 1 or 2 slides left. Cannabis cafes. I mean, did anything good happen this year? Yeah. Some good stuff did happen. Amongst the challenges, we did have some solid gains. So people are really excited about cannabis cafes and consumption lounges. Sessions by the Bay, going to be opening at the end of February, down in National City, is our first consumption lounge, and it basically allows cannabis lounges are now allowed to sell non-alcoholic food and drinks, which creates, a different consumer experience, and people are really, really excited about that. Regulatory approvals will honestly be a lot, very similar to the current structure, where again, your local municipality will have to say, yes, we allow consumption lounges, and this is where we will allow them and what it will, look like. And then you can ultimately get your state license as well. So that, I think that from a cannabis perspective, that process stays the same. Of course, you now have to think about food safety, and any other licenses that may be relevant when you're talking about that. And then another question is asking if the cafes will be able to serve cannabis infused prepared food. That's a really interesting question, and the answer is actually no, because our regulations state that a retailer can only sell foods like in their final form, packaged in their final form. So what you will see, I had a great chat with the Artistry group, and they have a few different lounges, but they're best known for their one in West Hollywood. What they do is, like, they would sell a mocktail that you could purchase, and then you can also purchase like your oil that's packaged, ready to go, and then you can administer that in your own drink. But the idea of like going and sitting down at a restaurant and ordering, duck confit, that's made with infused butters and things like that, and infused sauces, that's not going to be something that we can do at dispensaries. But there are a lot of ways that dispensaries are working through that so that they can stay in line with the regulations. Someone asked about the Canadian model, and I'm very sorry that I am not as abreast on that ultimately, so I can't really speak to that. But if you're interested, email me. I can definitely put you in touch with some amazing lawyers that practice in Canada. And another huge step forward is the end of the double taxation. So I see down here, there's another, excuse me, another question about, what steps need to be taken to reduce taxes? Would tax reform be addressed after rescheduling and legalization changes? So at the federal level, it's really dependent on what form this takes, right? If we remove to Schedule 3, fantastic. 280E, not really a problem anymore at the federal level. But if we go again for congressional reform, where it's some of these different bills, then it's going to depend. And at the state level, it's all lobbying. It's it's groups that are going to have to come together and work really, really hard to make this change. But a great change that was made. This is one of the things I was actually really happy to see is SB 1059, which eliminates local government's practice of including state taxes in their base price for local tax assessment. So they were basically including like the state excise tax and sales tax. And it was just like compounding, right? If you are taxing at literally every level of the supply chain, you're going to make that product so expensive that of course people are going to go to the illicit market to get it. So it's complicated. But that was, again, that was a big step forward. Um, I think, let's see, what else? There was a bill that tried to refelonize cultivation of seven or more plants. So that was didn't pass. So that was an important one that I kept my eye on as well. And again, we're running out of time here. And I will just do my last slide and then I'll answer any questions I didn't get to. I do see there's one more. Last slide, please. So, what do I think is going to happen? Here's one thing I'll say. I don't know, guys. I'm not an oracle. I think what we do know is that at the federal level right now, anything can happen. Anything is fair game. This administration could honestly do anything, and I will be keeping my eye on it, same as you. I think we'll continue to see more state reform. People are very excited about potentially Pennsylvania and Hawaii looking for adult use. I don't really know a ton about Kansas and the Carolinas, but in my readings, I've been told those are some states to watch for medical use. I do have hope for banking reform. I think it's really common sense at this point. And again, I think Trump has indicated some support for it. And I do sort of see a world in which like he could advance that forward without going the whole 9 yards and still call it a win. So maybe we'll see that. And I think, as far as like my actual practice is concerned, what we're going to see, I do think we're going to see an acceleration of M&A transactions. It was, I can tell you, certainly a lot slower last year than it was in the years past. But part of the problem is that in, 2020 through 2022, the price for, these dispensaries was astronomical and people were paying way too much. And again, a lot of it was seller financed and high interest rates. And, it's not unusual to have a hard money loan for 15%. And there's not enough margins to be able to pay for that, unless you can really, really scale and scale quickly. So I think for better or worse, what we'll continue to see are more distressed assets that multi-state operators will sweep up. And then that will have, you'll have more market consolidation. And maybe even a new, like a new wave of operators that are going to come in. I've always said, I think the smart money is really waiting. For the first wave to have passed and now here we are. And I think that the challenges and infighting and debates about how we regulate hemp, again, at the federal level and here in the state of California, will continue to rage on. Again, there's huge divide even within the California cannabis industry about what that should look like and how we should approach this. And again, rescheduling, if only, guys, if only I truly knew the answer, I'd be a rich lady. I don't, so I'll be watching the same as you. And then I see, again, please jump off if you need to. I know I'm over a little bit. I thank everyone for bearing with me, but I do want to try and answer this, excuse me, this last question, which says, do you think that if the public or voters became more aware of the substances listed on DEA Schedule 1 and 2, there would be greater support for cannabis rescheduling or descheduling? For example, DEA currently classifies cocaine and meth as Schedule 2 substances. That is such a good question. And in previous presentations for many years, I've talked a lot about how cocaine is Schedule 2, and especially in reference to like why Schedule 2 wouldn't work for 280E because of it's Schedule 1 or 2. Honestly, I don't think so, because I think the people that are desirous of up-to-date information and those that are truly seeking knowledge about the medical efficacy of cannabis and its true dangers are aware. Um, it's really this old guard that's really just like holding on so tight to this status. And I also think, um, I'll use AOC because I quoted her in today's presentation. I think, and I'm not talking necessarily even about where she stands on different issues, but that age range, as we start to see younger, younger people step into office and power and control, as opposed again to this sort of like boomer old guard, you will continue to see a shift. But that's, again, that's slow, that's incremental. Like people my age are starting to run for city council and mayor, and that's wonderful. And they will hopefully continue to ascend the ranks and then give a more common sense approach. But no, I think if you are married to it's a gateway drug and the children, if you're married to that position, I don't think that it's going to make a difference. I think really we need a changing of the guard. And that is just going to be when, again, like our contemporaries begin to take office, and the way that we discuss marijuana, like with our children and what that looks like. And again, I'm not advocating for a dispensary to be across the street from a school, or things like that. But I do think we still have a lot of that like reefer madness that exists, and those folks aren't interested in some of the more nuanced and relevant and newer studies that would debunk some of those theories. But maybe, I mean, we could certainly go on a campaign to educate, but I don't think it moves the needle for those folks. But I am hopeful, and you can go to the last slide. Feel free to reach out to me if you have questions, if you want to discuss. I work again with a lot of attorneys who this touches their practice in some way, but they're not totally familiar with it. And so I can come in with an assist in either an official capacity or even to just rattle with you and kind of troubleshoot. If you're a litigator and you're seeing, you will definitely start to see more litigation for sure within this space. And I've had the pleasure of serving as an expert witness for a couple different cases. It touches every area of law, it really does. So please don't hesitate to contact me. Even if it's just like, hey, I'm interested in XYZ, can you point me in the right direction? I'm more than happy to do so. And that's it. So I think I got all the questions that I could answer. And I really appreciate everyone hanging out.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, for such an interesting presentation. There was an individual that said very informative and
Oh, thank
thank
you.
you. And then there was another individual who said that they just wanted to say thank you for the awesome webinar. So I wanted to make sure you saw those too.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I had a lot of fun deep diving for this one, especially, like I'm not an expert on administrative law by any stretch of the imagination. And it did feel like a crazy ping pong ball. And as I was trying to like set out the timeline, I had to toggle back because like, wait, this happened and this motion was filed. So it's really interesting, and I really enjoyed preparing. And thank you everyone so much. I appreciate it.
Well, we really appreciate you coming and speaking for us today. And I also wanted to say thank you to the participants for attending today. And again, just wanted to send a reminder that we are going to have a link to a survey at the end of this presentation, and that we'd greatly appreciate any of those who took the time to answer that survey. Thank you
Likewise,
again.
I read it. I really do, and I build upon it. So I appreciate that as well.
Yeah, and it's helpful for us in planning what other MCLE classes to have. But thank you, Kimberly, and thank you to everyone. That's the end of today's MCLE presentation.
Thanks, everyone, and Happy New Year. Stay safe out there.